Hi, good afternoon. I'm Katie Teitler. I'm Senior Analyst at Tag Cyber, and today I am here with Raj Mallempati, COO at CloudKnox. We've spoken with Raj before, but today we're going to dive a little bit into CloudKnox's platform and what they do. Raj, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So we're really excited. We did another video with you and talked a little bit about the company in general, the strategy, where you're headed. So I want to begin today with why CloudKnox? Why do enterprises need to secure their hybrid cloud infrastructures, starting with managing identity privilege?
Sure. The problem statement, just to sort of think about the problem that we solve, is fundamentally, if I have to sort of highlight it, it's basically the fact that every enterprise has excessive permissions associated with their identities. And again, I just want to sort of refresh everybody's memory, but that what CloudKnox does is we manage permissions associated with any identity accessing cloud infrastructure. Again, cloud infrastructure could be multi-cloud infrastructure or hybrid cloud infrastructure like AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Azure, and VMware vSphere, right? So if you think about the problem statement and why customers use CloudKnox, it's because of a couple of reasons. Number one is that fundamentally every enterprise which has a multi-cloud or a hybrid cloud infrastructure, every one of their identities, or 95% of their identities, have excessive permissions. And when I say excessive permissions, they're using less than 10%. In fact, in most companies, it's less than 1% of those identities, right? That's the problem statement, and it's extremely complex to manage these identity permissions across a multi-cloud environment and a hybrid cloud environment, right? And because it's so complex, they don't have any visibility, they don't have any insight, and hence no control. And effectively, that's a huge challenge that customers face. And that's the new attack surface, if I may sort of articulate it that way. And that's the problem that CloudKnox solves.
So just to be clear for everybody listening, this is probably obvious, but we're not just talking about human identity here, right?
Absolutely. So we are talking about identity is the broad definition of identity. So if you think about identities, you've got the human identity. So that's users like you and I. And on top of it, you also have things like service accounts, right? Or service principals, right? And bots and the non-human identities, as I call it. So we manage permissions in the sense that we provide visibility in terms of the over-permissioned identities, both human and non-human. And at the same time, we also right-size or remediate those over-permissioned identities. So specifically, what I mean by that is that, if identities have, for example, right, 7,000 permissions granted, but they're only using 100 of those permissions, then this permissions gap that we have, we also provide the ability to right-size those permissions across human and non-human identities and across all those cloud infrastructure platforms.
With those kind of numbers, there's no way anybody could do this manually. No way.
Absolutely. In fact, what I just highlighted, right, is just for one particular or set of enterprise accounts. But if you take a step back and look at the total number of permissions, there are more than 40,000 permissions that can be granted across AWS, Azure, GCP, and VMware vSphere, right? So again, think about that, right? 40,000 permissions that can be granted. And it's not just 40,000 permissions, but the number of permissions keeps increasing as each of these platforms add additional cloud services, right? So the rate of change keeps increasing practically every quarter, right? Every quarter, about 1,000 plus permissions get introduced. So that's one challenge you have, right? The second one is with automation, right, with the DevOps evolution, more and more customers and more identities are accessing the cloud infrastructure, right? So as a result of that, the number of non-human identities is actually exponentially increasing, as well as the human users itself, right? So it's pretty much a big, massive problem and a big data problem too.
So this actually reminds me of something we've been talking about for years, patching. And you've occasionally got that security professional who says, well, just patch, just patch. And the same idea could be applied to least privilege. Just apply least privilege. But it's not that easy.
Yeah, and that is the reason why, in fact, that's the reason why it's always been a bit of a challenge, right, in the traditional environment. In fact, the interesting piece is that this whole notion of right-sizing permissions and then adhering to the principle of least privileges actually is even more critical for public cloud infrastructure. And B is actually significantly more complex to solve in the public cloud infrastructure, right? We're going from a few hundreds of permissions in a typical, let's just say, Windows-based environment to 40,000 plus permissions, right? With the rate of change, again, making it more complex, right? So again, that's the challenge that we all have, or any enterprise that's deploying public cloud or a hybrid cloud infrastructure has, right? And the second key thing, if you think about the challenges with the principle of least privileges, is historically what every enterprise has done is basically think of it as it was an assumption-based approach to trying to solve this least privilege policy conundrum, right, for lack of better words, right? Now, what we do is activity-based authorization, based on data, based on historical permissions that are being used by any given identity. We right-size the permissions, right? So it's effectively very much a data-driven approach to right-sizing permissions, reducing the permissions gap, and enabling us all to follow the principle of least privileges.
Well, that certainly sounds logical, a data-driven approach with automation that allows you to scale. And right now, in the last 6 or 8 months or so, we've seen that transition to cloud that we've been seeing all along, but at an accelerated pace. Companies
Yes.
are adopting cloud, public cloud, especially out of necessity right now. And so it can be an even bigger problem. So let's switch from that explanation that you just gave us to what are some of the implications of not managing your identities? So for example, what are some of the recent breaches or publicly known incidents that the people watching today might be familiar with that were precipitated by failure to manage identities? So what are some of the warnings for anybody listening and watching today?
Yeah, I mean, one of the largest incident happened a few months ago. I would say late last year, right? And in that, a malicious user, what they did is they assumed a role, right, associated with what's called EC2 instance, right? And again, what they did was they had the ability, so they basically had access to an over-permissioned role. They leveraged that role to list and literally take more than 100 million customer records, right? And the reason why this happened was because this malicious attacker was able to access a role which was over permission and was pretty much had never been used historically, right? And leveraged that new attack surface, as I highlighted earlier, to exfiltrate significant amount of data. right? So that's one example that was in the news significantly last year, right? In addition to that, there's like practically you'll see every month, if not every week, a significant number of these kind of challenges that large enterprises have. And sometimes it's malicious in terms of like external attackers leveraging these excessive permissioned identities, right? So leveraging that as a backdoor into this infrastructure, and sometimes it is actually inadvertently sort of done by some insiders, right? So think of it as an insider threat, and the reason that happens is because the insiders or the internal employees itself don't know the implication of their actions, right? So, you've got quite a few of those examples where an entire data center went down. In fact, recently, there was one employee who ended up deleting, I think, close to 400 virtual machines, and that impacted one of the online, web conferencing applications, right? And again, I'm trying to be respectful of not naming any names here, right? So, but again, these are incidents that are publicly that we are aware of. So just imagine the number of incidents that potentially have happened and we don't even know about them, right? So this is
Right.
again a huge problem across the board.
Right. And it doesn't, as you said, it doesn't have to be malicious, but
Yes.
something clearly needs to be done about too many permissions, over provisioning, anything that could lead to a compromise, whether intentional or unintentional.
Right. It all starts with, I mean, it's not like a security team doesn't want to actually right size these over permission identities, right? So in fact, they are clamoring to do that, right? But you have to get started somewhere, right? And to get started, you need to have visibility, right? Visibility in terms of, hey, look, this identity has these 7,000, 8,000 permissions granted, and they're only using 100 or 50 or 200, whatever the case is, right? So that visibility itself is lacking with existing solutions. And that's the challenge that the security team faces day in, day out, right? They don't have the basic visibility, and hence they cannot drive any insights, and hence they have pretty much zero control, I would say, right? And that's the reason why I say authorization at the cloud infrastructure level, it's not just broken, it just absolutely does not exist, right? And because they don't even have the basic visibility, right? If I don't have visibility, again, going back to what I just said, if I don't have that visibility, how can I fix the problem, right? That's the kind of that's the biggest challenge that the security operations team has right now when they're managing the cloud infrastructure. And obviously, it magnifies when you have a multi-cloud or a hybrid cloud infrastructure.
So that's great. So it starts with visibility and then it goes into some more of the tactical things about identifying and shutting down permissions. What do companies need to do on their end if they want to start? If they want to start with getting that visibility and then gaining control, what do they have to do with their infrastructure, with their permissions in terms of configuration to start if they want to deploy CloudKnox?
Yeah, so CloudKnox is a SaaS-based solution. So it's a very simple solution, so to speak, to deploy. Literally, it takes a solution like CloudKnox, which what we do is enterprise permissions management. It takes us less than 30 minutes to deploy, and can be completely operational in terms of understanding or getting visibility into your permissions gap, right? Your identity permissions gap in less than 24 hours, right? That's it, right? I mean, that's all that's required to be up and running and actually getting visibility, and also provide right sizing those over permission identities, right? It's literally 30 minutes to be up and running, and then another no more than a day to be completely operational. That's all it's required. And then
So no
what we
network
do is
change.
we have, yes, no more
Okay.
changes. And what we do is, in fact, what we do is free risk assessment, because fundamentally what we want our customers and prospects to do, or any enterprise to do, is deploy the CloudKnox permissions management platform in their infrastructure, figure out what those permission gaps are across their identities and across their cloud infrastructure, and then and then decide how they actually want to go and operationalize it across their entire infrastructure itself. Right? So the free risk assessment is what we do all the time.
What does that look like? So most customers, it sounds like quick and easy deployment. They get up and running. They're in visibility mode. They're in visibility mode, not invisibility mode, just to be clear. They're in visibility or alert only or monitor mode only. How quickly do most of your customers move to enforcement or some other form of action?
Yeah, so typically what the customers do is, because our platform provides them with the ability to take immediate action. So typically there are two steps that they do, right? When it's in a visibility only mode or read only mode, what they do is they take some of the scripts that we generate, the remediation scripts, and then they apply themselves. The reason they're doing it is, think of it as a test before you buy kind of scenario, right? They just want to make sure that the recommendations you're providing are actually providing them the identities with the least privilege policies, right? So that's all they do. And once they're comfortable with that, they automate the entire process, right? So the level of comfort, typically, I mean, they do it for a few different accounts, a few different subscriptions, depending on the platform, and that's it, right? I mean, it's all about the security operations team being comfortable with our recommendations, and then once they're comfortable, they sort of let the automation take over. Right? That's typically what happens across our customers.
So it depends on how much of a skeptic an operations pro might be, but it sounds pretty easy.
Yes, and honestly, it is just a matter of giving the right permissions, right? So if you want to switch from a read-only mode to a read plus write mode, it's just literally just turning on one additional permission. That's all that's required, right? Part of our, I mean, the way we've built the platform, it is to keep it extremely simple and very easy to deploy and also to operate. And the key goal here again is to make sure we can also automate the entire life cycle. So it's visibility, then the alerting mechanism, and also the remediation mechanism, right? We want to make sure we can actually make it extremely easy to deploy with the existing infrastructure that customers have. So it's automating using your existing infrastructure so that we can be part of the overall enterprise tech stack, for lack of better words.
Well, that sounds good, integrating into the overall enterprise tech stack. Well, Raj, thank you so much for this discussion about CloudKnox and the platform. Thank you to everybody who's listening and watching. And we'll see you next time on our next video.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure talking to you.